at the end. This session will be followed by final thanks from the organisers, and then there will be a wine reception in the atrium. So we'll be back out there shortly. So we are starting this final panel with Dr. Peter Whitewood. He's the Associate Head of School for History, American Studies and War Studies, and publishes broadly on the Soviet military. Today, his talk is entitled History, the Bolsheviks' Perceptions of Ukraine and Soviet Security, 1921 to 1928. Pete, your 50 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Esther. Okay, so in a panel about the ongoing war in Ukraine, I'm going to start by talking about events from 100 years ago. That's because some of Vladimir Putin's recent comments have made headlines for echoing the very type of comments delivered by Stalin in the 1930s at the height of the Great Terror. So specifically that so-called traitors, pro-Western fifth columnists needed to be ejected from Russia in this kind of process of self-purification. Now, Putin is no stranger to echoing the Soviet past, but it's something which has become more extreme since the war began. But I've also been struck by the similarities between how the Putin regime frames the war in Ukraine to how the early Soviet Stalinist regime framed its security concerns around Soviet Ukraine 100 years ago, so back in the 1920s. Now, the geography of Europe has changed quite a lot since then and now, but the conspiracy theories which underpinned how the Kremlin saw Ukraine in the 1920s and how it does so today, I think they remain quite consistent. So in this way, as much as the comparisons made between the ongoing war today and the Cold War are right, I think there's also a deeper set of historical parallels. So how did the Bolsheviks see Ukraine in the 1920s? At that time, of course, it was a Soviet republic on the Soviet Union's porous and vulnerable western border. Well, before the 1930s and before Hitler's Germany became Stalin's main preoccupation, the chief foreign policy threat identified by the Bolsheviks was a war against a coalition of enemy states headed by Poland. So this would also include the Baltic states, Finland, and apparently was to be supported and financed by international capital, Britain, France, and so on. And in the 20s, the Bolsheviks were certain that such an alliance was inevitable and this war was inevitable. And they also believed that the most likely field of battle was Ukraine. Now, this wasn't a total fantasy. As ever with Soviet security assessments, there was always a kernel of truth. Western powers had, of course, intervened in the Russian Civil War to try and end Bolshevik rule. One of the most dramatic conflicts of the Civil War era was the war against Poland, which Soviet Russia fought in 1920 to 21. And this was an attempt by Lenin to spread revolution to Poland by force, which of course failed. But this particular war against Poland escalated in the first place when Joseph Pilsudski, who was the chief of state of Poland at that time, he attacked Soviet Ukraine in April 1920. But the key thing to underline is for the Bolsheviks and for Vladimir Lenin, this war was not just a war against Poland. It was in truth a war against Britain and France. They were seen as the key backers in this conflict. They were pulling the strings and what have you. And so these are the outlines of what Lenin called capitalist encirclement, right? So it's a key concept which Lenin put forward and something which Stalin later inherited. The basic idea of capitalist encirclement was that Soviet Russia was dangerously encircled by enemy powers, by capitalist powers, that anti-Soviet coalitions were constantly in creation, a cataclysmic war between communism and capitalism was inevitable. Now, of course, this was an exaggerated security picture, even if capitalist states had at one time attempted interventions in Soviet Russia and were continually hostile for the most part in the 20s and 30s. The truth was, of course, the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia was not facing inevitable war in the 1920s, but in the Kremlin, this was precisely the worldview in that decade. And we can see this in the masses of correspondence now available to historians, to researchers. Stalin's correspondence is run through with conspiracies about enemy states, working up plots against the Soviet Union. And within this internal correspondence, it's Ukraine which features time and time again as one of the vulnerable points in the Soviet system. And so on an almost yearly basis, the Bolsheviks predicted war. They always said it would come each spring, but of course, war never arrived. There are other ways too in which the Soviet leadership saw Ukraine as a vulnerable part of their system. In the years after the revolution, Ukraine was almost always judged as vulnerable to subversion by foreign powers. These Soviet security organs, the Cheka, GPU, OGPU, they policed the western border regions and Ukraine almost continually, looking for any signs of Polish subversion. In their view, the key threats on the ground were Ukrainian nationalist organizations. Fighting for independence, physical fighting between groups was commonplace. Now, Ukrainian nationalist groups, certainly in the early 20s, did receive some assistance from the Polish government. And the Bolsheviks knew this. However, this is very quickly curtailed in almost immediately after the civil war in 1921. The Polish government does not want to keep up open support of nationalist groups, even if Polish intelligence does kind of do this secretly for a while yet. But the Bolsheviks believed this support was continuing. And they also believed that Britain and France, other powerful Western countries, were also funding Ukrainian nationalist organizations. And so for this reason, you get policies such as the Soviet strengthening of the border regions in Ukraine. In 1923, they order mass purging of the border regions of anyone deemed kind of a subversive or an enemy. But even so, none of this actually seems to resolve their security anxieties. In 1925, so a few years later, in June, one of Stalin's close allies, Lazar Kaganovich, he claims that Ukraine is a bridgehead in a future war against Poland and Romania. So this war scare is almost continual. Later in May 1926, and in another demonstration in how far the Bolsheviks' kind of fears about war could go, Joseph Pilsudski, who of course led Poland's conflict against Soviet Russia in 1920, he returns to power through a coup d'etat in that year. But almost immediately, this alarm bells are ringing in the Kremlin about a new war. A very senior and influential Bolshevik, Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the head of the political police until his death in 1926, he writes to Stalin personally in July 1926 to say that Poland is now planning a new war. They're going to seize Ukraine and Belarusia. The British government is acting in support. None of this, of course, is true. The reality was that Pilsudski, even though he was hostile to the Bolsheviks, he had no intention to launch a war. You know, the Polish economy was not doing very well. He was more interested in internal consolidation. 1 year later, in 1927, another example is that when the Soviet ambassador, the Soviet head of the legation in Warsaw is assassinated, Stalin's first instinct is to compare the murder to that of Franz Ferdinand in 1914. He writes this in a letter to another ally, Molotov. So you can see that the pattern is the same. There's an exaggerated sense of war inside the Soviet elite. The danger is perceived to be a coalition, anti-Soviet coalition of enemy states backed by foreign capitalist powers, and Ukraine is consistently presented as the center of a likely conflict. And by the 1920s, by the end of the 1920s, little of this had changed. In fact, it had got worse. From 1928, the Soviet political police were expending even more energy in Soviet Ukraine on the ground, arresting and imprisoning members of a so-called Polish military organization. Now, the Polish military organization had not existed since 1921. It was defunct for 7 or 8 years by this point, but the arrests happened. The Bolsheviks were convinced it was alive and well in Soviet Ukraine, and thousands of pages of testimony are collated. You know, these are held in archives, and nearly all of these investigations were based upon false confessions, torture, and awful violent methods. And Ukraine is a special worry for Moscow in the late 20s and early 30s. Also because of the violence and turmoil which has been produced by collectivization of agriculture. So the states attempt to seize control of the grain supply across the country. Because in Ukraine, this is where there was most turmoil to collectivization. It's where peasant resistance was fiercest. Half of the resistance and acts of resistance, to collectivization also happened on the border between Ukraine and Poland. So this is another kind of security worry. And Stalin's preoccupation with a new war reaches new heights at this time. So in 1930, he's thinking about war, increasingly. In March of that year, he writes to Molotov again, speculating that the Polish government is forming a new coalition for a future war. He stresses that the Soviet Union needs to build up its reserves. And all of this has serious consequences for the people of Ukraine, where the problems of internal subversives is deemed to be particularly acute. In 1930, in March, the Ukrainian political police, they launched new operations in which nearly 12,000 Ukrainian citizens are arrested. The border zones of the right bank Ukraine are purged of Polish nationals. They're targeted in particular. Thousands of families are exiled. So why Soviet Ukraine suffered so greatly in these years is because it was deemed to be at risk of both internal and external threats, and the two are interrelated. Stalin made grain requisitions so unremitting in Ukraine because he wanted to crush a wave of peasant resistance, but he also believed that the republic would be less vulnerable to subversion and invasion as a result. As is well known, the direct consequence of collectivization was a horrific famine which took hold from 1932, and millions of Ukrainians died as a result. Amid these horrors, in August 1932, Stalin fires off another telegram again to Kaganovich, revealing his priorities once again. And here he warned that given the upheaval in Ukraine, there was a risk of losing the republic entirely to Poland. So you've got this same threat re-emerging. The Poles, according to Stalin, might seize their chance while the Soviet Union is vulnerable, and so its geopolitics, underpinned by conspiracy theories, were as ever at the forefront of Stalin's mind. So to briefly conclude, today, the Russian government, like the Soviet one 100 years ago, sees Ukraine as critical to its security and geopolitical influence. Putin is motivated by conquest, undoubtedly. He seeks to simply expand Russia's territory and influence. But like the Soviet leadership 100 years ago, I'm mostly convinced that Putin also sees the outside world with a conspiratorial lens. Whether it's nationalist movements in the 1920s, Soviet Ukraine, or pro-democracy groups in recent years, both the Stalinist and Putin regimes point to outside forces, Britain or the United States, as exercising the real power and influence. I've been struck in particular by the outsized role given to Britain in the current Russian media coverage of the war as supposedly, behind the scenes pulling the strings. It's almost like going back to the 1920s with Lenin's capitalist encirclement. Now, the Stalinist regime and Putin regimes are different in many respects, right? That's also clear. Putin does not have such an ideologically charged view of the world as Stalin. But I don't ignore how he is framing and talking about the war today, whether that is American plots or British plots, his views on NATO or whatever else, because this isn't a new development. We don't have to think back too far to see how Putin talked about the Orange Revolution and continues to talk about it through this kind of conspiratorial lens. And for decades, scholars of the Soviet Union rejected entirely this idea that the things that Stalin said in public, he could believe in private. There was always a view that Stalin spoke with one voice to the people and spoke with another voice behind closed doors. But since the archives became accessible, it's clear that the things Stalin said in public, he said in private, right? They said the same things. And I think that, this isn't to say that we should take Putin's words at face value, but I think we have to recognize that his worldview is shaped by the weight of the Soviet past, by the fact that conspiracy theories for so long underpinned Soviet security assessments about the world and their worldview, and that happened for decades. And Putin is also an increasingly isolated figure in the Kremlin. That's something from the pandemic in particular. And so maybe we do need to pay attention to the things that he says, even when they appear outlandish. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Still with a minute to spare. So second, this afternoon, we have Dr. Mark Dawson. He's the course lead for the programs in religion here at York St John University and publishes, broadly speaking, on the fair trade movement. Mark's talk today is entitled Philosophy and Ethics, Public Theology and the War in Ukraine.
Thank you, Esther. So my theme today is public theology and the war in Ukraine. To shed light on the nature of public theology, I will firstly discuss the role that it is played regarding the hosting of Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers here in the UK, before moving on to discuss the relationship between theology and the state in the Orthodox Church. And there are some recent documents and developments in that area. I take public theology to mean the sharing of the insights of faith with a wide public beyond religious communities, contributing to issues of public interest and by means of an open conversation. Here in York, York is a city of sanctuary. And in the early weeks of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a large rally was held here in the city to call for peace and for the UK government to do what it can to welcome those fleeing from the terror to come to our country. Sanctuary has church roots and its supporters draw on the goodwill and support of churchgoers, working alongside people of other faiths and backgrounds to enact care and compassion towards refugees and asylum seekers. Politicians across the globe are utilising the populist theory of the other as a means to garner support or perhaps deflect attention away from policy failings, have set out to create an environment which is hostile to people seeking to escape from persecution and conflict. The refugee is dehumanised and defined as a problem, or as part of a threatening force, such as a flood or plague. And many of us, almost regardless of what part of the world we live in, have become familiar with this sort of terminology, including, I've heard it on our very own BBC as well, describing groups of people as monks. Sadly, this does succeed in shaping public opinion, which is then used in turn to justify more stringent controls to block those trying to reach a safe haven. There is certainly a role here for public theology in attempting to break this vicious circle. Countercultural ways of thought are needed in order to interrupt this paradigm. The outlook of hospitality and welcome associated with many religions, including the Christian faith, can serve as such a source. And this is particularly suited to the Abrahamic religions, which all have their roots in the Middle East, which has a long-standing tradition of hospitality. Indeed, Susanna Snyder, who's a Christian theologian, identifies a Christian outlook towards refugees and asylum seekers as one that preferences the most unfortunate in society. Those who have very few possessions and very low status, or in the case of the stateless, no status at all. Although there are certainly voices within the church that support this paradigm of hostility, in many ways, grassroots churchgoers have endeavoured to put theology into practice. Churches and other communities have been involved in providing practical support to refugees and asylum seekers, have worked to try and unite families, and through symbolic and practical activism, have campaigned to move towards a system that is more welcoming. The public response to the conflict in Ukraine has also served to interrupt the paradigm of fear and hostility towards refugees. Moved by the terrible brutality that civilians have been subjected to, and the recognition of a public powerlessness in this situation, a sympathetic climate has been kindled. One can but hope that this marks a paradigm shift, with the realisation this can happen to anyone, even to people we perceive to lead lives similar to our own. The UK government has been remarkably slow to respond to the concerned attitude of the British public towards the Ukrainian refugees. This serves to underline the embedded nature of this culture of hostility. Care and compassion are replaced by a stultifying legalistic approach, a mixture of Kafkaesque indifference and sheer callousness, as key government figures mount support for the people of Ukraine, while whilst going out of their way to ensure that as few Ukrainians as possible receive sanctuary here. Catherine Briddick of the University of Oxford Refugee Studies Centre points out that the UK requirements for visas effectively contradict the 1951 Refugee Convention, which protects people from being rejected at frontiers for entering a country without permission. Briddick argues that the visa system institutes just such a form of permission. She also sets out the potentially illegal response in the context of the Nationality and Borders Bill that has recently passed through Parliament. This paves the way to criminalise people who are seeking protection and will make it much harder for them to achieve refugee status. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has commented that the proposed system will undermine established international refugee rules and practices. With these plans afoot, scant wonder that the government is squirming in the face of public pressure to let those most in need in this conflict seek sanctuary in our country. It also explains the disgraceful levels of inaction. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, recently intervened in what can be described as an act of public theology to describe the processing of asylum seekers in Rwanda as not of God. Although he thought it unlikely, Boris Johnson commented that it could be possible for Ukrainian refugees to be sent to Rwanda for this processing to take place. The UK government has been at the forefront on the international stage calling for concerted action to support Ukraine. And yet we see it place its own populist agenda before any support for people fleeing the war in Ukraine. Not least to say the many other conflicts that are taking place across the globe. The church in the UK is right to add its voice, offering the insights of faith to a wide public discussion. But what of a theology which, rather than adding its voice in public discussion, seeks to dominate, co-opt, or be co-opted by a prevalent populist paradigm? The position of Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and many of the Patriarchate in refusing to acknowledge Russia's war against Ukraine and the bloody nature of the conflict and its impact upon civilians serves as an example of a relationship between church and state, which is unhealthily close. Kirill's invocation of the Ruski Mir, one people, one language, one Orthodox church hierarchy, and one political leadership, reinforces Putin's justification for his acts of terrorist violence. As with all populist agendas, a common enemy is identified, and here it is the West, which is perceived as alien and antagonistic to Russian values, as lived out in the Russian Orthodox Church. As a Christian theologian, I do feel an obligation to call out on what I regard as the misuse of the Christian faith in order to justify political agendas, which run contrary to the Christian gospel of peace and justice. Indeed, leading Orthodox theologians and clerics have signed a declaration on the Ruski Mir teaching, which denounces the Moscow Patriarch's linking of church teaching with national chauvinism. This declaration has been published in the journal Public Orthodoxy. The declaration criticizes the Patriarchate's stance for engendering division and not praying for peace. Crucially, it is described as a heresy and undermines Orthodox teaching on the kingdom of God, which should never be confused with earthly powers or political elites. The declaration states, "We reject the Russian world heresy and the shameful actions of the government of Russia in unleashing war against Ukraine, which flows from this vile and indefensible teaching with the connivance of the Russian Orthodox Church, as profoundly unorthodox, unchristian, and against humanity." Orthodox theologian Aristotle Papanikolaou, writing in 2017, expresses concern at the Russian Orthodox Church critique of human rights and political liberalism, positioning itself as the godly in contrast to the secular and Western. Papanikolaou rejects such a duality and calls for a church which serves the world rather than focus on its own influence and self-preservation. A very different relationship between church and world than that put forward by Patriarch Kirill is suggested by the 2020 document For the Life of the World Toward a Social Ethos of the Orthodox Church. This was written at the request of the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, and endorsed by the Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarch. For the Life of the World calls for separation between the church and political institutions. It views the Eucharist as a critique of all political regimes and states that the institutional association of Christianity with the interest of the state should be as tenuous as possible. The document is particularly unequivocal when discussing issues of race and nationalism, decrying any forms of nationalism, including, or perhaps particularly, forms of Christian nationalism. As Vasilios Thermos points out, the document seeks to desacralize national borders and close down on the concept of the Holy War, or for that matter, a holy special intervention. Although the document has come under criticism for potential overstatement, it is certainly prescient when speaking of violence. And I quote here from the document For the Life of the World. The highest expression of Christian holiness in response to violence is perhaps found in those who strive every day to create understanding and respect amongst persons, to prevent conflict, to reunite those who are divided, to seek to create economic and social mechanisms for alleviating the problems that often lead to violence, and to welcome and care for those who are marginalized and suffering. This seems to me to be a prophetic document, prescient for our times, and representative of Orthodox theology in a manner that Patriarch Kirill can never achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Keeping very well to time today. So unfortunately, Isla is unable to be with us today. I'll say more about Isla in closing statements. So we move on to Professor Pauline Kollontai, who is Professor Emerita of Higher Education, and she works broadly in public religion, conflict, and peace studies. And Pauline's talk today is entitled Israel's Geopolitical Response to Russia's Invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you, Esther. So the issue explored in my paper is why Israel self-identified as a Jewish and democratic state with an explicit commitment in its founding declaration to uphold the biblical prophetic values of justice, peace, and freedom, behaves in such a cautious manner towards Russia and its war in Ukraine. I need to say my interest in this is not only academic, but personal because I am a Jew. I'm going to do this briefly by looking at what the character of Israel's response has been so far, public opinion, what are the divisions, differences with growing in Israeli official circles, responses for Israel's response, and basically my reflection on what needs to be done. So Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who you know has been replaced 2 weeks ago by Yair Lapid, has said that the danger to Israel's security of upsetting Russia is too great a risk to take. He has said that his strategy was a responsible and measured approach which protects Israel's interest while providing the opportunity for Israel to try and help find a solution to end the war. Now, Israel's stance raises two main questions for me. First, what does Israel's response to Putin, an external actor, of course, engaged in the destruction of another country, tell us about the character and state of democracy in Israel when faced with safeguarding its own country and people? Second, what is Israel's commitment to teachings in the Jewish tradition that emphasize protecting the honor and dignity of others, or the command of seeking justice or freeing the oppressed? The moral imperatives of justice, ethics, and morality are taught in the Torah, and which includes the Jewish prophets, And they are religious ideas and obligations, not just an optional way to behave. So what has Israel done or not done so far as regards Russia? Israel, we know, has continued to refuse to join the US and European nations in imposing sanctions on Moscow and Russian businesses. It has not sent military hardware to Ukraine, but recently announced in May that it would provide protective military equipment, such as helmets and vests. Now, one Israeli retired general said, speaking on this issue, the whole concept of defensive weapons is tricky. Even a helmet could be considered offensive if it emboldens a soldier to fight harder and do more damage. In that view, he said, the slightest Israeli misstep could trigger Russia's wrath against Israel. On the humanitarian front, Israel has provided Ukraine with a fully staffed field hospital, six large generators for a hospital in Kiev, 10 ambulances, and 100 tons of humanitarian aid. It's also taken in 24,000 Ukrainian refugees, only 1/3 of whom are Jewish. Now, on the diplomatic scene, Israel also has been mixed in its response. It did vote in favor of 2 UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia. It supported the motion for Russia's removal from the UN Human Rights Council, but it did not endorse the February resolution by the UN Security Council, which deplored in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine and demanded the immediate withdrawal of the troops. So just very briefly, what has been Israeli public response? Amongst the Israeli public, there has been an emotional and angry reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Israel Democracy Institute survey conducted on the 3rd of March showed 78% of Jewish Israeli respondents rejected Russia's rationale for the invasion, saying it was justified. And 55% of Israeli Arab citizens said that Russia's use of force in Ukraine was unjustified. Asked who was to blame for the war then, what did they say? 76% of Israeli Jews said it was Putin and Russia, compared to only 27% of Israeli Arabs who said that ultimately NATO countries and the USA were responsible for the war. In another survey done on the 25th of March, 60% of all Israelis, Jews and Arabs, agreed that Israel's decision not to be fully involved in the European and USA sanctions and military supplies against Russia was the correct policy. So briefly, a key point, I think, here is to ask how to understand the dissonance of the Jewish Israeli public's emotional and angry reaction to Russia's war in Ukraine, while Israelis themselves impose one of the cruelest and longest occupations in modern times on millions of Palestinians. How does this rare Israeli consensus, which supports the Ukrainian people's struggle for independence, confirm with a view that ranges from enthusiastic support to indifference over the perpetuation of the Israeli regime of oppression over Palestine? So what are the reasons given by Israel's political and security communities for this neutral stance? First, Russia is a critical player regarding Iran's nuclear program and has supported Iran with nuclear reactors in the past. Second, Israel faces a threat as Iran's military presence grows in Syria and Iran's arming of Hezbollah with precision-guided missiles in the country. But Russia has had a significant presence in Syria since 2015, supporting the Syrian government-led civil war. Now then, as a result, Russia controls Syrian airspace, and Putin had already given permission to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in 2015 for Israel to enter Syrian airspace to attack Iranian operations considered a threat to Israel. That this agreement will continue is being thrown into question, as in mid-May it was reported that Israeli military activity in Syria targeting Iranian sites in south of Damascus had taken place. And on the 7th of June, the air forces of Russia and Syria conducted a joint drill over land near the northern Israeli border in an exercise to show that they could counteract hostile weapons, warplanes and drones. Third reason, Russia has a large military presence and advanced weapon systems in Syria on Israel's northern border with the country. Fourth, both Russia and Ukraine have relatively large Jewish populations. Their safety and welfare are critical concerns for Israel. And we can see now in recent weeks that these concerns are justified, as Israeli sources reported pressure on Russian Jewish religious leaders in Moscow in particular were growing to tell them to speak and say and show their support for the war in Ukraine. And if not, they would begin to shut down Jewish institutions. Of course, we know that 2 weeks ago, Putin announced that the Jewish agency headquarters in Moscow had been shut down. In one thing, we must be united, said one of the Jewish rabbis, though, who takes a more critical stance. He says, our duty to God is to strive with all our might for mutual understanding, for mutual respect, and in no case should Russia raise a sword against our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Israeli official voices of condemnation of Putin's approach. Although Prime Minister Bennett has pursued a cautious and muted strategy towards Putin, not all Israeli officials have maintained this position, particularly in statements by Yair Lapid, who is now the interim Prime Minister, and a small number of other Israeli officials. For example, on the 13th of March, during his visit to the border of Romania and Ukraine, Lapid said, quote, Israel, like Romania, condemns the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is unjustifiable, and we call on Russia to cease its fire and aggression. On April the 3rd, Israel's ambassador to the Ukraine responded to the massacre of civilians in Bucha, saying it was definitely a war crime. It cannot be justified, he said. A more explicit statement then came from Israel's health minister during his visit to Western Ukraine, saying that he wanted to show solidarity with Ukraine and in the face of a brutal Russian invasion and of the massacres and war crimes being discovered across the country. Bennett has also condemned the Bucha massacre, but he did not blame or criticize Russia explicitly. Whereas Foreign Minister Lapid publicly stated that Russian forces had committed the war crimes against a defenseless civilian population, he said, I strongly condemn these war crimes. There has been some criticism from within Israel's policy and security community about Bennett's approach to Russia. Different people saying it was potentially damaging to Israel's strategic military alliance with America and Europe, and it throwed into question Israel's position as a democracy. Another critical voice is Zahava Galon, former head of the left-wing Meretz party, who served in the Knesset for 16 years, and now is head of Zulat, an independent think tank in Israel, working for equality and human rights for all. Galon said in recent weeks that she finds it personally painful to see Israel's government refusing to explicitly condemn Putin and refraining from sending arms to the Ukraine. Galon's view is that Israel is failing a moral test. She argues, we have to protect the rights of people around the world, people who need our help. So in conclusion, these are my thoughts. Galon and others like her are, I think, expressing the Jewish tradition's universal teachings about responsibility toward all human beings throughout the entire world. Of course, there is a tension in Judaism between the self-interest of the Jewish people in their homeland and that of all humanity, and this is certainly evident in Bennett's approach to Russia. This is Jewish particularism versus universalism. Now, we know that every faith community is committed to its own survival and continuation. Jews have sometimes fallen prey to see themselves in very parochial terms, to believe that their interests supersede all else and everyone else's, especially true in times of crisis. In contemporary contexts, this defensiveness extends to times when Israel sees itself at risk either from war, terrorism, or other key international events. I would argue that the urgent challenge for Israel is to find an equilibrium between its own self-interest and the wider interest of humanity. And of course, in this case, we're talking about the people of Ukraine. And for me, this is a principle that is one of the key cornerstones of a democracy and an essential part of the Jewish tradition. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Pauline. So our final speaker in this panel today is Dr. Victoria Nesfield. She's a lecturer in religion here at York St John University, and she publishes in Holocaust Studies. Vicky's talk today is entitled Never Again, History and the Question of Intervention.
Thank you, Esther. So in thinking about Never Again, what I'd like to focus on is the imperative, which I'm sure we've all come across from time to time, and particularly the Holocaust narrative that has re-emerged through this conflict on both the Ukrainian and Russian side and in both narratives, and which reminds us that Holocaust memory remains as politically useful as it is unresolved in Eastern Europe and possibly beyond that. Although there are varied interpretations, a widely accepted origin of the expression Never Again is the 1926 poem Masada by Isaac Lamdan about the Roman siege of the fortress and subsequent legend of mass suicide there. The poem contains the line, "Never again shall Masada fall." But by the early 20th century, Masada was firmly replanted in Jewish thought, with revolution, anti-Semitism on the rise in Europe, and the Zionist movement gaining traction. And we've now become familiar with this maxim, never again, in response to war and genocide around the world. It's been cried in street protests and woven into politicians' speeches. And we've seen this following genocides in Africa, in Europe, military juntas in Latin America and Southeast Asia. But its roots in anti-Jewish persecution, however, and the sheer scale of devastation of the Holocaust served to reinforce the connection of the phrase with the geopolitical history in Eastern Europe. So inevitably, it didn't take long to emerge in Ukraine. On the third day of the invasion into Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the EU saying, "Europe said never again, but here we are." He repeated this in a Hebrew language post on Facebook following the shelling near Babi Yar, or the Babi Yar Memorial outside of Kyiv, addressing Hebrew-speaking Jews around the world. "We were all bombed last night in Kyiv, and we all died again at Babi Yar from the missile attack, even though the world pledges never again." Zelensky has shown himself to be a master of the well-aimed political speech, particularly targeting Western leaders in Western countries, from mimicking Churchill's fighting talk in Westminster to reminding the US Congress of the trauma of 9/11. But as familiar and perhaps even fatigued as we are with this call, or more precisely fatigued by the seeming impotence of it, the cultural, geopolitical and historical resonance of never again is all the sharper in Ukraine, where the references to Nazism and genocide are more than just easy political rhetoric, but are still the long shadows cast by the Second World War, and particularly 1941. Ukraine in 1941 was the battleground of Operation Barbarossa and the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in contravention of the 1939 non-aggression pact between the Soviets and the Germans. That road to Leningrad is strewn with the sites of anti-Semitic and anti-Soviet atrocities, and Babi Yar probably the most notorious. And by this point in Nazi history, appeasement had already demonstrably failed. The Munich Agreement and subsequent annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938 had indicated that Allied Europe was quite prepared to witness the carving up of frontier countries in the interest of protecting their own. Neville Chamberlain's desire for peace with honor and a nice quiet sleep was surely to Hitler a sign of Allied hesitancy. This reluctance of the West to put themselves in the firing line is so clearly echoed in the narrative of the war in Ukraine. And that is to say, in Zelensky's repeated requests for more direct assistance, particularly from NATO. And I'm not suggesting here that UN and NATO policy should be discarded, nor am I defending them. But in the context of 1938, the Munich Security Council, in its February meeting just days before the invasion, seemed ironic. As the conflict has endured over the past weeks and now months, non-stop news updates in all their originally horrific detail, and at the time punctuated by concerns about the economy, the cost of oil and gas, and even serious questions about the possibility of nuclear war, seem now to have dissipated more to concerns about the economy and the cost of living around the world. For example, just 2 weeks after the invasion, Romania, to Ukraine's south and another frontier nation, saw petrol prices double in the space of 2 hours, pharmacies sell out of iodine tablets, and the government forced to quell concerns about the conscription of men up to 60 years old, following an alleged draft policy leaking. 5 months on, the devastating impact of the Black Sea blockade, the paralyzed grain exports, and the cost of living is taking up more headline space than the conflict itself. A February visit to Kyiv from the leaders of 3 of Ukraine's other direct neighbors, Poland, Slovenia, Czech Republic, suggests that it didn't take long for a chasm to emerge between those buffer nations, in whose living memory Soviet might was already seared, and those further away, for whom vested interests and years of turning a blind eye are only now starting to bite, in spite of everything Boris Johnson has been telling us about the UK being the first and the most active country. But back to 1941. In September, just 3 months into Operation Barbarossa, the first and most notorious of a series of massacres took place in the Babi Yar ravine, just outside of Kyiv. In just 2 days, almost 34,000 Jews were executed en masse by the German Einsatzgruppen, accompanied by auxiliaries, likely including the Ukrainian auxiliary police. And so begins the Nazism label that Russia continues to promote in this conflict to its own ends. Further massacres of the Jews, the Roma, and Soviet prisoners of war took place until 1943, by which time it was estimated that Babi Yar ravine was the grave of some 100,000 people. Like much of post-communist Eastern Europe, that Holocaust narrative, however, was either silenced or subverted in the communist days. The crimes of Nazism remembered as anti-Soviet or anti-communist persecutions, the specific targeting of Jews made invisible. And it wasn't until the fall of communism that the reclaiming of Holocaust memory and a reluctant reappraisal of the history books started to take place. Holocaust scholarship in Ukraine, as with its post-communist neighbors, has been hindered by a lack of access to archives and records, and a historical amnesia, both genuine, the result of 40 years of propagated communist history, and cultivated by those shielding their past roles or perhaps still harboring anti-Semitic beliefs. Unpicking this contentious issue of civilian auxiliary forces and occupied nations committing crimes alongside the Nazi Wehrmacht gained attention in 1996 with the publication of Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners, focusing on German crimes. Then came Jan T. Gross's Neighbors in 2000, detailing Poland's history. And as late as 2008, Patrick Desbois' The Holocaust by Bullets, revealing, after painstaking research, more of the history of the Einsatzgruppen's mass executions by shooting in occupied Ukraine. These moments of history are what Sue Weiss has called the unrepresentable face of the Holocaust. No narrative to explain how occupied civilians could turn on their neighbors with such brutality, no survivors to give voice to Jewish memory, and for decades, no public or political soul searching to truly attempt to come to terms with this. And this tension is surely exploited and continues to be exploitable by the Russian propaganda machine. As recently as September last year, the memorial at Babi Yar, an enormous menorah monument, was on Zelensky's political agenda, and the politics of memory still as hot as ever. A previous initiative had sought to create a commemoration project there, but one in which the narrative was expected to present Ukraine as a victim nation crushed between the twin totalitarian regimes of communism and Nazism. The electoral defeat of former President Petro Poroshenko, supporter of the initiative, is the likely reason the project stalled. In its place has emerged a different project intended to foreground the Jewish catastrophe, but also to reflect on issues of nationalism and Ukrainian society at the time of the Nazi occupation. President Zelensky has given this initiative his support. Unsurprisingly, so has Israel. At least up until the recent sanctioning actions, it also had the support of several Russian oligarchs. As an interesting aside to this discussion, the memorial is under the administration of a vague collection of some 15 local organizations, one of which is a shooting range. The missile strike on the current monument prompted another never again call to international response from Zelensky, who tweeted, "What is the point of saying never again for 80 years if the world stays silent when a bomb drops on the same site?" It remains to be seen whether Ukraine will nationalize the Babi Yar monument following the conflict, and to what extent future commemorations of the Holocaust will indeed reflect on this thorny issue of nationalism, of which we heard a lot about this morning. What is likely, though, is that the urgent and enormous task of rebuilding so much of Ukraine may make a painstaking self-examination of the Holocaust take a backseat for now. And this may raise eyebrows among some of Ukraine's neighbors, those who have taken in the majority of Ukrainian refugees, who sent their politicians to the front lines, and who've coordinated so much of the aid operations at the border, but for whom EU membership was hard won or still pending. For the post-communist countries seeking membership to the EU, a concerted facing up to their nation's wartime past was a requisite. The EU might be united in diversity, but certainly not where the Holocaust is concerned. Never again may still be the best call we have on the streets in response to genocide and war, but leaders need a policy of more substance. On top of the enormous task of firstly seeing this conflict come to an end and then rebuilding Ukraine, Zelensky has a further emotionally charged challenge ahead. Rehabilitating his traumatized nation while at the same time unpicking some of the nationalism that has realistically been so vital to the tenacity of the Ukrainian people. Or perhaps harnessing some of that national spirit, but in a way that does not similarly repeat the dangerous nationalism that firstly permitted the Holocaust and then denied Jewish survivors a voice in the aftermath. Ukraine's fast track to EU candidate status, as it looks more and more to the West, happened with incredible speed, particularly given the pessimism within the EU as recently as March. And it's no stretch to imagine that Allied hesitancy in the 1930s is still haunting the West as much as it is the East. The Holocaust and the failed political diplomacy that opened the door to it remains unresolved, and until it is, it's remaining a useful touchstone for both Ukrainian and Russian political narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. We do have plenty of time for questions now, but we would ask you, if you're asking a question, to use a microphone so that our colleagues who are joining us on Zoom can hear you. Thank you. And Tom here will be ready to pass you the microphone. Who would like to start us off? Yeah, thank you.
So in the absence of anybody else, I'll chip in. I'm sure people are just warming up with even better questions. First of all, each one of you, fantastic presentations, really thoughtful, disturbing in the right way. I think it's important we address some of these serious issues. Mark, very interesting, if you like, education in public theology, something that I lack hugely. And you linked it to the refugee crisis, and you quite rightly spoke about the reaction, the public reaction to the Ukrainian refugees. How would you describe the difference in that reaction from the reaction to other refugees. I mean, of course, this country quite rightly has a good tradition compared to many in accepting refugees, a proud tradition, I think. But there is a differential there. And if it can be explained in theological terms, fine, but are there other explanations? That would be good. And if I could also ask a question to Pauline, if I may. I think you end with a very important question. How do you balance the national interest with what I would describe as international justice? And everyone is forced to look at Ukraine as in isolation. And I think, Vicky, you described, I think, or illustrated better than most of us, the weaponization of history. Incidentally, I don't know if you know, but there is such a thing as influence operations, which are associated with special forces. And I am willing to put some money on this, that when history reveals itself, we'll find that there is a British educated speechwriter for the Ukrainian president, who's probably studied history or international relations or even war studies, possibly at York or other good universities. The point is, what has led to this awful situation? Why has this monster suddenly appeared on the horizon, who's doing these monstrous things? Was the world full of law and order, that where people did stuff and people didn't invade countries on crazy stories, pretexts? Or is it that we are internationally responsible for creating the situations where these nasty people and these nasty situations can exist, and can we solve it without solving the underlying problem?
Thank you. Thanks so much for the question, a great question. So I suppose what is behind this is, I mentioned a sort of breaking of the paradigm via the war in Ukraine and a public interest in the rights of people fleeing war, and a public climate which has become quite welcoming to the idea of people fleeing the war in Ukraine coming to the UK. This public urge, of course, has been prevented because of by political means, so all the red tape that people have to jump through to get here. So within your question, it then begs the notion, well, and I mentioned what of all the other conflicts that are going on in the world, of which there are a large number, and we saw a huge number of refugees from the crisis in Syria, to name just but one. Whereas this wasn't attended in the UK by the same level of enthusiasm or attempt to break away from the populist fear of the other. And so, in fact, if anything, the public reaction to the war in Syria pretty much just reinforced, was brought in this kind of wall of indifference to people who were fleeing that conflict. So there are numerous issues here. It has been talked about quite a lot about whether people can make connections with those who are fleeing war. So, and perhaps on a negative side, perhaps one could argue that the public were able to empathize with people in Ukraine, whereas not so much in Syria. And one could posit quite a number of reasons behind that. One could be familiarity with the conflict. By and large, people were the British public quite mystified by what's happening in Syria, misinformation or lack of information from the media about various conflicts. We have very long-standing conflict in Yemen, which is barely covered at all by the media here. What is covered is quite simplistic, and so quite difficult for to engender a breaking of the paradigm of the fear of the other. And so I'm really suggesting a sort of public climate where the dice are pretty much loaded in favor of following a populist paradigm of those dehumanizing those fleeing conflict, and reinforced by politicians and the media, quite difficult to get round. And I think the coverage, at least in the early stages of the war with Ukraine, did manage to break through this paradigm. People were able to see those involved in the conflict as human beings with human rights. And so regarding theology in this, I identified a role for public theology in trying to break down this paradigm. And so it is about humanizing people who have been and continue to be dehumanized by politicians, by the media, and this has had a lot of success in influencing public opinion and for political agendas. So I identify a key role in theology in challenging the state and media and popular paradigms to emphasize humanity and look at the dignity of all human beings by virtue of being made in the image of God, to reintroduce a humanity for people who have been sadly and in some ways almost bafflingly dehumanized. It should be the default human position to be able to relate to those who are involved in the most terrible conflicts, or the most terrible poverty, which refugees and asylum seekers, this is what it means. Being persecuted in their own countries or coming from war zones. Sadly, there is a paradigm there and it does need to be broken through. And so, I identify a clear role for theology in doing so.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just, before passing on to Vicky to answer your other question, I think there's also been mass demonization of Russia. And I think that the British public like we know who the good guys are, we know who the bad guys are type story. And there's very much been promotion of Ukraine as the good guys, even getting Zelensky to speak to Parliament and, all that sort of thing. So real promotion of the Ukrainians are the good guys here, the Russians are the bad guys, which makes it much easier for people to take sides. And I think in all those other conflicts, it's perceived as being, it's so much more messy. We don't know who's on the right side here because of lack of information or misinformation. But definitely there's been a polarization of the way Ukraine and Russia are being portrayed. And no doubt at some point in the future, we will hear about atrocities on the Ukrainian side as well as on the Russian side, which whereas at the moment it's war crimes on the Russian side is what we're primarily hearing about.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the question. I don't think, very briefly, I don't think there's ever been a time when we haven't had these figures and these regimes they're doing harm to their own people, to other people. And we just this afternoon we were hearing about China and the Uyghur Muslims, and we know it's happening. We can just tut or be exasperated or feel completely helpless, but it still happens, and we still know, and we still from time to time think about it or shut it off, and we still carry on buying things from China and remaining dependent on these people, as we've seen Europe has been with Russia. This hasn't come out of the blue, and European dependence on Russian oil has been something that's been talked about for quite a long time. So don't have a great answer for you, but I don't think these people just come out of thin air. I think they're there around the world. It's just when it starts to affect us a bit more directly that the focus suddenly shifts. But thank you for your comment about the script writers as well. Yes, they're engaging reading. I'd be interested to know who's behind those as well.
Okay. Well, I think you raised something about my bright ideal about equilibrium, Israel needing to do that. So I don't have an absolute answer. And I wouldn't wish to have an absolute answer because it's a project, I think, in process, but it needs to be addressed quickly. I think there's three areas really. There needs to be a political shift in Israel from this pretty right-wing governments that we've had, particularly since 2006, back more to the center with more of a left-wing influence. I don't know whether that's going to happen with the coming election in November. Certainly the religious Orthodox establishment, which is recognized, does not speak out on these issues. Well, am I surprised at that? No, because their theology of land and exclusionism is all about how Jewish particularism, and we're always wanting to protect ourselves and ensure our security. I think the other religious establishments, which are not officially recognized, so that's the Reform and Liberal Judaism communities, need to find ways in order to promote what they're saying, where there's a lot of opposition to Israel's stance. Civil society as well, lots of civil rights groups, human rights, peace groups I think they are trying to speak out, but it's how you influence, particularly really enforced religious political ideology and borders on xenophobic nationalism, I suppose. So I think there are areas, that need to have some shifts and find ways more enabled to not only speak out publicly, but also to try and influence official policy. I think my final point would be to say, basically, Jewish particularism is a false way of seeking the ongoing security of Jews. And whether you look at that both as a religious perspective or a political perspective, it is the fact that, yes, we have been persecuted throughout history, but that does not give us the right to oppress other people, as I mentioned with the Palestinian issue, but it does not give us a right to stand on the sidelines of history and see these other atrocities going on. I think there is a cost to be paid as human beings, as nation states, if we claim that we are democratic, and there are different models of democracy, we know. And I think we have to have the moral courage to really pull together an equilibrium between that particularism and the universalism of the teachings within the Jewish tradition.
Thank you both. Yeah, there's a question down here, Tom.
Thank you very much. Just a quick remark to Arthur's comment. We do know those people who are following the Russosphere, who do have the linguistic capabilities, that President Zelensky has a very strong team working on informational war capabilities. And they turn to be particularly effective by using both the Russian, Soviet methods and also the Western ones. And apparently the Westerners are helping a lot. And the Ukrainians have learned a lot since the beginning of the war back in 2014. So this explains why quite a lot of Russians, they do indeed recognize that they are actually losing the informational war, not only to the West, which is another issue, but also to the Ukrainians on the battleground within the Russosphere as well, to a pretty large degree. So this is definitely occurring. And thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I do have several questions. actually. And, this was a very fortunate or unfortunate for the Russians moment that they decided to take a war on Ukraine when Ukraine had elected an actor, a professional actor, indeed a comedian, and he is using that to this resources, the skills to his full capacities, and I believe that he is very effective. And this was very unfortunate for the Russians because President Zelensky also happens to be of Jewish descent, and he is open about that, and he is proud about that in a good sense of the later word. And thus the question that I wanted to ask Pauline is about whether the identity of Zelensky is being played out and is known and is talked about as an issue within the Israeli public narrative, meaning that here there is Ukraine, the regime is being described as a Nazi one by the Russian propaganda machine, but the president is Jewish, right? And apparently his family members suffered from the Holocaust back in the 20th century. He was pretty open about that as well. So how come? Where does that come from? And so is there any kind of such a debate? Do the Israelis in general know this, and how do they approach this question? And then the second aspect in this regard would probably be more of an akin to a comment. Would it be correct to assess that part of the Israeli government's reluctance to choose the sides also has to do with the society itself, with Israeli society, considering that the last post-Sovietalia, the wave, is largely composed of the Jews, or at least the people who claim Jewish descent from mostly Russia and Ukraine. And apparently the word on the street, right, in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem is that those people who come from Russia, those people who come from Ukraine, or even separate people who come from Russia, they tend to disagree very harshly on this particular conflict, and that might eventually lead to conflicts on the street, like, so to speak, right, among the representatives of the area. So would you agree that this also might be a problem that the government has to consider seriously? And then also we have a question to Peter. Very fascinating presentation. I liked it a lot. Within it, as far as while you were approaching the conspiracy theorists, you focused on the state actors, right? The United States, Britain, and all of those manifestations and echoes, right, of the days bygone that we are feeling and hearing these days as well. But what about non-state actors? Because those were very prominent in terms of propagandistic narratives, ranging from the global capitalist conspiracy, which was not necessarily related to the states, to the nation states themselves, to alleged Zionist conspiracy, anti-Semitism being a prominent factor in the Soviet Union, which turned to be particularly apparent, obviously, in the late Stalinist years with the doctor's case. And currently, quite obviously, there is a lot of talk about Soros conspiracy, about the LGBT Q plus, all of them willing to kind of impose the post materials values on conservative and believing Russian fortress and all of that. Do you see the echoes in this regard as well, as far as non-state actors are concerned, between the narratives and the interwar years and the post-revolutionary years and the current Putin regime narrative? Thank
you. Thank you for your questions. They definitely know in all sectors of Israeli society that Zelensky, is Jewish. All the areas of media have made comments about this and consider this, so that's not an issue. I know there are some in different circles, political, security circles, in public organizations that say, yes, we know he's Jewish, but actually, is there a point at which, because our own security may be at threat, because if we upset Russia, that actually we really can't do so much to help Russia. Now, there's opinions across Israeli society about that. And that comes back to this fear and the memory of years of centuries of persecution, but also the Holocaust. And I think that is something about how you use memory as well. And I haven't got time to go into that. And I know Vicky would be an expert on that anyway. But how do you use the memory of victimhood? And my opinion from spending quite a lot of time in Israel is I think that the victimhood syndrome, I would say, and I don't mean that offensively, has become very contaminated with the fact that victimhood itself is problematic, I think. And so it's to do with memory. How do I remember that I was persecuted? Does that mean I must always put my own security, even when it's about saving other Jews? So that's all I want to say on that. Differences of public opinion, you are right. And I think that comes out in the poll that was done in March. Basically, 78% of Israeli Jews across the country said Russia is wrong, it shouldn't have invaded. But only 60%, and that's, I couldn't get the breakdown of Israeli Jews, but Israeli Jews and Israeli Arab citizens, 60% said that the policy of not following what the US and Europe are doing, sanctions and providing military, is correct. Now, so is that a reason why the Bennett government have not adopted this? I don't know, because I haven't researched it in detail. But my initial thinking, and I have thought about this, is I don't think that's the main reason why he's not adopted it. I think it's because he has a whole environment around him, political and security circles, that are always saying security of Israel and the Jewish people are paramount. And so that will be my response at this stage. But it's a very interesting question, I think. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. And I guess the short answer is yes, I am. I also see that the Soviet state under Stalin in the 20s and 30s also concentrated in their own kind of conspiracies and worldview, also on the non-state actors. And a few examples might be the white armies, when they're in emigration, when they're they're scattered across Europe, they're kind of a non-state force, but they're consistently presented as a supporting kind of group who might might join any invasion, which is periodically predicted. You've also got down to the International Red Cross, for instance. In the Civil War, the Bolsheviks and Stalin included. Stalin writes in 1920s, in his correspondence, talking about the Red Cross in terms of being an espionage organization, and they orders their arrest of its members at that time. And even later in the 20s, because I spoke about Poland quite a lot, even when it's quite clear to the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs, so those most closely involved with diplomacy, that Poland is not going to launch a war. The intelligence that comes through from elsewhere, from the Soviet military intelligence or the political police, highlights things like it's the capitalists, it's Polish industrialists who have influence on the Polish government. So this conspiracy, it's almost kind of ever evolving, I think. And what explains that is the nature of the Soviet information gathering system. That the Soviet Union under Stalin had one of the biggest intelligence networks in Europe, but it didn't necessarily make it a good information gathering system. And that's because it was interpreted chiefly by Stalin, the things that are coming across his desk, and that in turn shaped the type of stuff he received. And I think within that's why it's always evolving. Some threats rise and fall, but you're absolutely right that it's about state and non-state actors, and sometimes it's manifestly clear to those reading the intelligence and producing it that a particular state or government is not a threat, and then actually you find that it's the non-state actors which kind of pop up to take their place. So the threat never really diminishes. I think that's the key thing.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Is it on? Okay. So thank you so much for these presentations. Unfortunately, I was late, so I could only listen to the later two ones, and my questions would go over there. Taking a look at the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, I think, as Konstantinos pointed out, this is also a kind of competition on who is going to end up having the Nazi stamp on them. So Russians claim Ukrainians are Nazis. Ukrainians claim the same of Russians. And going back to what Pauline has just mentioned and what Konstantinos pointed out, there is a tangible part of the Israeli population coming from these areas. And we have to admit that both in Russia and both in Ukraine, there is a tangible anti-Semitism within the population. So these claims unfortunately are not coming from nowhere. Ukrainians have been complicit in the Holocaust. Russians have committed pogroms, and we know about the Soviet times as well, that there were mass atrocities over there. So my questions to Pauline is that when it comes to helping Ukraine in Israel, is there any kind of debate on should we help these people who committed these acts against Jews? So is there any kind of narrative or debate within Israeli society about this? The fact that there is still anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and inevitably, I think there is before the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, we saw the destructive face of Ukrainian nationalism and the assimilative face of Ukrainian nationalism, hence the conflict between the Hungarian government and the Ukrainian government. And there was inevitably conflict between the Polish government and the Romanian government and the Ukrainian government before the conflict because of the treatment of minorities. So this is not just a Jewish issue. So my question to Vicky would be that, and maybe the time is not long enough, but is there any debate within Ukrainian society on how to confront this issue of this alleged Nazi stamp or stigma? Thank you.
No, you go first.
I don't know is the short answer to, is there debate within Ukraine about this Nazi stamp, but I do know that there is debate, as you pointed out, among those border nations. Romania, I know a little bit more about, and certainly that was one of the narratives that was quite loud, if you like, in the media when the border countries were on the news, and we were seeing the floods of adopting that language unconsciously, but the refugees coming into the countries. That it was in the media. Well, the Romanian schools were being shut down in Ukraine before this, under the previous government. Romanian language was being eroded from Ukrainian society. So that element is very much there, and I imagine it is there among the other neighboring countries. So it's not a Nazi motif, if you like. That's not the way it's being presented in Romania, to the best of my knowledge. But of course, all of these countries have their own histories to confront with that period of time. The problem as well with all of these nations, I think, is that these political figures disappear for a while and they resurface in new regimes, new governments, new roles, and so there's never quite, or it never quite feels like there's a clean break from one regime to another. We'll just pop back up in other guises. Within Ukraine, I think the conversation will have to happen. I can't say now in what shape it will take, but I do think that, especially as I talked about, Zelensky before this conflict started was on board with trying to reshape Holocaust memory in the wider context of Ukrainian nationality and nationalism. I think it's more vital now when this finally reaches its conclusion that he stands by that and he does look at that, because before this conflict, it wasn't one united Ukrainian identity by any means, and it won't suddenly be one united Ukrainian identity after this. But thank you for the question. It's a really good one. Thank you.
Right, so this is what I know. From my sources, which are predominantly really to do with key media sources, so that's national newspapers across the spectrum, also Israeli 24 News and watching that, and also occasionally other things that filter to me from different sources. I would say there is not, I don't think we would call it a debate at this stage. I have seen and heard of certain Jewish voices, particularly in the political establishment, security establishment, some wider society organizations, religious organizations as well, that have sort of raised this issue. Well, of course, Ukraine was involved in some of these genocides, you know, during the Holocaust period, and we should be mindful that they have had a history of fascism. So I've seen some of that. Now that is being raised, but it's not then what I've seen necessarily being said, well, we shouldn't do anything about the Ukraine. But I think that feeds into this public opinion. The other thing is, there have been voices publicly raised that they do not like Zelensky continually identify what's happening in Ukraine with the Holocaust. So they don't like that. And I think that's not just about because he's Jewish and there are Jews. And he has done that actually, and that's irritated quite key prominent public figures in Israel. I don't know so much about the wider public, opinion about that, which I myself haven't worked that through yet, whether that's right to say that or no. So that's something I'm trying to work through. So that would be my response to you.
Well, thank you very much. So as not to keep you from the wine reception is the next event. We will move on to our closing remarks, but first we could just thank our panel members again. So as the closing session, it just remains for me to say thank you very much to all of our speakers, not just today, but throughout the last 3 days, many of whom have had to leave us already. And a special thanks to those of you who've traveled a very long distance to be here. It's great to see you. A conference like this isn't possible without the speakers and without the audience who are prepared to engage and ask questions too. So thanks again to all of you for being here. Also, a conference like this takes an enormous lot of work in the background. And so it is a great shame that Isla is not able to be here today, having been instrumental in bringing this conference to York St John University. So I'd like to express our thanks to Isla for all her hard work, and also to her colleagues in Turkey at Sesran International, who have also not been able to be here as a result of Home Office incompetencies, as Isla put it at the opening session. So a very great thanks to them too for making this conference possible and for us being able to hold it here at York St John in this new creative centre. Do our colleagues from Sesran wish to say something? Oscar, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
We can't
Hello,
hear
everyone. You can't hear me? Can you hear me right now? Can you hear me right now?
Still
Nope.
can't hear you. To try, maybe. No, that's one drive. It might be the last one.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
No, we still can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Sorry about that. Nope.
Sorry, Oscar, I don't know what the problem is. Isla, I see that you are with us. Do you wish to say anything? Are you not well enough? You're muted.
Yes, did I manage to unmute myself? Did I manage to unmute myself? Can you hear me now? I was able to hear you. Can you hear me now?
No, it must be something to do with the speakers in here. There must be different speakers. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, none of us are technologically capable of enabling you to hear people on the other side of Zoom. But so yeah, so once again, thank you all very much for being here, and we will adjourn to the atrium. Please do enjoy the wine reception. Yeah, and all we can do is give our colleagues at Sesran International a wave. We've all enjoyed hearing such stimulating and thought-provoking papers, and I'm sure you've all made new connections academically and in your thought processes, and there'll be much to follow up on in the coming months and years, and we'll look out for future conferences for the 10th International Conference on Eurasian Politics and Society. Thank you very much. Thank you.